Good morning, everyone. Our speaker today has one of those job titles that makes you do a double take, Senior Vector Entomologist. That's a fancy way of saying he spends his days figuring out how to outsmart some of the nastiest critters on the planet: mosquitoes, bedbugs, flies, wasps, and yes, today's star of the show, ticks. Josiah Ritchey works out of the Rentokil-Terminix North American Innovation Center in Dallas, Texas, where he develops cutting-edge control strategies for pests that can actually make people sick. And if you think you already know everything about ticks, well, that's exactly what he's here to fix. Please welcome Senior Vector Entomologist Josiah Ritchey.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, I don't know if you all remember, but I was here last November talking about yellow jackets, which in their own right are a nuisance and scary from a health perspective or a public health perspective. But ticks are one of, I think, the hardest things we work on, and you'll see that term hard come up several times throughout this presentation as we talk mostly about hard ticks, but they're again one of the hardest things I think we work on right now. And even just putting this presentation together, I was learning a few things, and they're very fascinating, but also very scary because of all the diseases they spread. And that kind of leads into where I want to start. This is obviously a TikTok, although I will not be doing any dances or anything else too ridiculous. Uh, but if you've seen any of the news recently, you know that tick abundance, and again, potentially more importantly, the diseases that ticks spread or vector are increasing in abundance not only in the state of Texas, but really across the entirety of North America. And so the outline of today is effectively to, again, briefly explain why all of us as pest management professionals need to be thinking about ticks as we provide services to our customers. Just like mosquitoes, ticks are, again, not only a really big nuisance, but maybe even more so than mosquitoes. They spread a variety of nasty pathogens to us, our pets, and as we'll talk about a little bit, to a lot of domesticated animals that we all rely on as well, or many people rely on, rather. In order to better understand how to control ticks, we're then going to jump into a little bit of concepts, understanding their biology a bit better, their habits, and more importantly, the habitats they occupy that should hopefully improve everyone's ability to manage these pests whenever you encounter them in your day-to-day. We're then going to go through a bit more specific things related to treatment, and going to talk about an integrated pest management concept surrounding ticks, nicely named as integrated tick management, as we adapt IPM to all sorts of different pests. And then at the end, I'm going to talk quickly about some additional points about ticks that I think would be really valuable to share, how to remove ticks, and then also a little bit briefly on licensure and what you need to be aware of based on where you're doing ticks and who has hired you. So to the first point, I've already talked a little bit about this, but just wanted to put some stats to this because they're pretty shocking stats. But in general, vector-borne diseases from arthropods generally account for actually nearly 20% of all the infectious disease globally. That means we're talking about every major disease that's spread, not just by mosquitoes and ticks or other arthropods, but all diseases in general. 20% of those are spread from vectors. And particularly, most of those vectors are going to come from insects and other biting arthropods like ticks. As this slide shows briefly, mosquitoes do again account for the majority of this disease globally, but more specific to North America and the US in particular, ticks are actually the leading cause of vector-borne disease in the US, causing about 77% of vector-borne diseases every year in the US specifically. Thankfully, the CDC and other various agencies monitor primarily the number of emergency room cases that are associated with tick bites by specific regions across the US, and they publish this data publicly online for free. Unfortunately, as this graph shows, the CDC from 2024 to 2025 saw a 20% increase in the number of ER visits associated with tick bites. And I didn't show all these graphs, obviously, for lack of space, but if you look back over 2023, 2022, 2021, you do see this steady increase following this pattern that you can see on these two graphs. But overall, the number of ER visits that are associated with tick bites are just increasing, and they're probably going to increase over time as we move forward. So a real huge problem. We couldn't talk about tick-borne disease without talking about the star of the show, which is Lyme disease. It's one of the most widespread and dangerous diseases ticks actually cause or they spread. It's actually, and I caught myself there, ticks are not actually the cause of Lyme disease specifically. They are just the vector, which actually spreads that disease. What causes Lyme disease and the symptoms associated with it, like other vector-borne diseases, is actually caused by a spirochete bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi. This is a kind of sinister-looking corkscrew bacteria you can see on this image on the right that actually twists its way like a corkscrew into the cells of the host that it inhabits. So not only is Lyme disease scary, but the bacteria that causes it, I think, is also particularly a little bit sinister looking as well. What's more shocking is that the CDC doesn't necessarily monitor, they can't know every single infection that happens from any disease, let alone Lyme disease. But their estimates are that around 500,000 people probably are infected with Lyme disease each year that have a variety of symptoms. Some people may never know they get it. Some people may have very acute and severe reactions to it immediately. But nonetheless, that's a huge number. In the Northeast, specifically in the Northeast, rather, up to 50% of the black-legged tick population in the wild, these are, again, your deer ticks, are probably infected with the pathogen Borrelia burgdorferi, which is really crazy to imagine. That's basically effectively a coin flip. If you go out and find any deer tick in the environment, and in the Northeast, as someone from Pennsylvania originally, deer ticks are everywhere. If you grab one of those random ticks, you have a coin flip chance that it has this bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So I think these are just shocking stats to talk about when we're talking about the impact ticks have. And I put this slide in here because I think it does translate a little bit better to the Midwest region, the South Midwest, Texas specifically. Ticks are not just a problem for humans. As I mentioned earlier, they're a huge problem for domesticated livestock as well, most notably cattle. And these two ticks that I have shown here, the southern cattle fever tick and the cattle fever tick, they both transmit bovine babiosis, which is otherwise known as Texas cattle fever. Thankfully, this disease does not impact humans, but as you can imagine, it has a severe economic impact on the cattle industry. I put this picture up here. It's a little bit graphic and unfortunate to look at, but effectively what this disease causes in ticks is severe anemia because the pathogens these ticks spread actually attack the red blood cells of the cow. They will typically have a red-colored urine from broken red blood cells, a swollen liver, swollen spleen, and it really effectively destroys the red blood cells of cows, which, as you can imagine, will eventually result in death if they're not treated. Another shocking stat here, I don't have it typed out, but I looked it up, is that without treatment, and most ranchers are pretty on top of this rather than letting it go if it's affecting their cattle, but this disease can kill up to 90% of the cattle that it infects without treatment. And again, easy to understand and conceptualize that this can have a severe impact on an industry. And so I hope at this point, I hope that wasn't too long of an intro, but again, I think some of those stats are just insane. I have you convinced that ticks are a real threat to humans, certain animals in specific, and thus they do fall squarely into the realm of responsibility for all of us as pest management professionals. And so you're probably asking yourself, many of you have probably dealt with ticks before, but some are saying, what do we do as PMPs to control ticks? They're clearly spreading. The diseases they spread are spreading. How do we get on top of this? And as I alluded to earlier, one of the newly developed adapted IPM strategies for ticks is called integrated tick management. And similar to other versions of IPM, um, this is another adapted version that really focuses on means of control that encompass more than one control strategy, such as the exclusive use of insecticidal products for control. For example, and this mirrors a lot of other things you've probably seen related to IPM, understanding more about tick identification, behavior, biology, what we're going to talk about today, can help you utilize current control strategies as effectively as possible, while also informing new strategies. And there's one on here that we'll talk about specifically later on. In the last few years, a number of both public and private research organizations have been focusing on the development of a variety of trapping technologies or traps that impact the hosts of juvenile ticks, and they're showing promise for reducing the number of ticks in certain environments throughout the country. And even longer, if not the past decade, maybe 2 decades, there's been ample evidence from the scientific literature showing how modifying the habitat or managing the habitat around a home or other specific property type can have a large impact on the suitability of the habitat for ticks. And so that obviously reduces the number of interactions that humans and our animals have with these vectors. Lastly, obviously, one of the most effective ways, tried and true, to kill ticks is obviously doing insecticidal applications that typically fall into targeted sprays or the use of granules in their habitat. They're very specific, or they're very effective, but there are some specific things to keep in mind that I'm going to cover today with regards to making those applications that can really determine how successful they are immediately and then over the long term to have some kind of residual control. And so on the first point, we're going to jump into a little bit about identification and biology of ticks. And I think this section really should be called the biology and identification section, because I'm going to talk a little bit about identification as a concept, but the treatment strategies and how ID relates to treatment really is quite similar from a pulled back 30,000-foot view with ticks. And so what I think disproportionately is more important is understanding the tick life cycle as it relates to optimal treatment times, what light stages to warn your customers about, and how to get effective control and protection for your customers. Nonetheless, obviously ID is very important, but ticks are also, as I mentioned, ticks are hard to ID. Nonetheless, we're going to cover some of the basics here, but I do urge people to seek out additional resources, and I link a few in this talk to sharpen yourself up on tick identification. So, very briefly, this won't be a surprise to many of you, but I just want to remind you, ticks are not insects. We have to use the term biting arthropod, not biting insect when we talk about ticks. Most ticks in their nymphal stage do only have 3 sets of legs, but adult ticks do have 4 sets of legs, and that puts them more closely related to things like spiders distantly, and then mites in a very close sense. And when we start to break down some of the more details about what ticks are, the 2 main categories are going to be our soft ticks and then our hard ticks. The soft ticks fall into the family Argacidae. The notable genera that we typically encounter is ticks in the genus Orthinodoros, as shown on this slide. The name probably gives it away, but they do frequently parasitize blood from birds, but they do also spread to other small mammals like our hard-bodied ticks. The majority of ticks that spring to mind, people will recognize, I think, a lot of these ticks, or at least the names, are going to be the hard ticks, and these are in the family Exotidae, or again, hard-bodied ticks. Notable genera in this group include the black-legged ticks, represented here by Ixodes scapularis in particular, but Ixodes in general. The Lone Star tick is in the genus Amblyomma, another huge group that we'll talk about. And then finally, the American dog tick and the brown dog tick, represented by the genera Dermacenter and Recip, Rhipicephalus. I'm not going to say that too many more times today. I'm just going to talk about dog ticks. But again, those two genera are represented by the American dog tick and the brown dog tick. And obviously, we know a lot about ticks at this stage. We're going to really be focusing on the hard body ticks, as I mentioned. It's not to say that soft body ticks are not important from a disease perspective. They definitely do transmit diseases like tick-borne relapsing fever, as shown on this slide. But the life history strategy and how they forage relative to hard ticks is quite different. And so the chances of you or your customers or anyone really you run into interacting with soft ticks at a high degree is pretty low. However, on the hard tick side, depending on where you're at in the country and depending on where you're at in the state, you may encounter many, many, many thousands of hard ticks. And so that's the focus of much of today's talk. But I will tangentially talk about soft ticks and things they share in common with hard ticks. These are a variety of the diseases that hard ticks spread. Many of these, again, will be familiar. The black-legged ticks and other ticks in the genus Ixodes primarily spread Lyme disease, but also other diseases such as anaplasmosis, babiosis, the Lone Star tick, and other ticks in the genus Amblyomma are primarily going to be spreading things like tularemia, stari, which is a southern tick-associated rash illness, and then one that is of high concern to a lot of people is alpha-gal, which we can talk about later. And then when we talk about dog ticks in these two genera, we're talking about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, ehrlichiosis, and tularemia. And I generally put the diseases that these various ticks spread in at least some type of categorization of maybe most severe that's associated with this tick down to less severe. But nonetheless, these are all diseases of high importance. And when we think about what a hard tick is and what classifies a hard tick as a hard tick, there are a few key characteristics that put ticks into this group. The basic body plan is characterized by a capitulum, which is that mouth part, basically handle, if you will, at the top of the ticks that contains all of their mouth parts and structures, enabling the tick to attach to hosts, get that blood meal, as well as inject, a local anesthetic, as well as inject all of the nasty pathogens into humans when they make a bite, or other animals. Hard ticks have a scutum, which is a shield-like covering that goes over the back of their thorax and over their abdomen. In female ticks, it covers some of the body, but not all of the body. In males, it covers the entirety of the body. So they have this large shield-like protection, at least over half of their body, if not their entire body. The marginal grooves that you can see around the outside of the tick are comprised of festoons. And these, in some ticks, are going to be really what's distinguishing between one species or another. And so I mentioned that tick identification can get challenging. It's not for some of our larger groups, but when you get into the weeds with ID, it always gets tough. But that's something that I just wanted to make known to everyone. One of the, I think, probably most interesting things about ticks and some of the things that they can sense and how they actually go about attacking humans and other animals is they have this specialized organ. So you can imagine ticks can't see very well. They don't have antennae. And the question becomes natural as to how are they so good at getting on people, or any animal, rather, for that matter. They actually have a specialized organ that is housed in the front part of their front legs. That's called the Haller's organ, and it can detect not only vibrations and CO2, much like antennae of mosquitoes, but it can actually detect body odors, humidity, and it can actually detect infrared light, which is effectively heat. So you can think of this organ in ticks as basically being kind of like a supersensory organ that again only ticks possess, and it makes sense that it can aid them greatly when they're seeking out a host. And so I mentioned a lot about ticks here, and how some features that characterize them. But I wanted to ask you all a question at this point. I mentioned the scutum and what distinguishes what the scutum looks like distinguishes whether or not you have a male or female tick. Uh, Based on this picture that is shown here, again of Ixodes scapularis, can anyone shout out or guess what sex, male or female, this tick is? Any takers? It might be too early, but this is a female tick. You can see that that scutum, that shield, does not cover the entire back of the abdomen, and so that makes this a female tick. Soft-bodied ticks are kind of like the aliens of the tick world, if ticks aren't alien enough. They do not have a shield-like scutum. They have a kind of amorphous, leathery covering over their body instead of that sclerotized scutum. Um, their their mouth parts are not sticking out of the front of their body. They're actually on the ventral side, so on the bottom of the ticks. And it certainly changes the way they interact with hosts, as well as, excuse me, probably have some impact on the duration of feeding they have on hosts as well. Unfortunately, they do still have that specialized Haller's organ that I mentioned about earlier. And so they are really good, again, at seeking out hosts. And I mentioned a lot about this Haller's organ, and obviously ticks get on mammals to get their blood. I don't think it's a shock to anyone. The title of this slide is "All Ticks Require Blood Meals to Survive and Reproduce," but that is a huge characteristic that defines ticks and a lot of other vector-borne uh, vector arthropods, biting arthropods. However, how ticks go about um, finding hosts actually differs quite a bit based on the type of tick you're dealing with. However, there are three main categories that ticks go about finding their host. The first is what's called questing. This is primarily displayed by ticks in the genus Ixodes, so these are going to be your deer ticks. They go about this host acquisition tactic by effectively crawling to a blade of grass, the end of a twig, or other stick that's in the environment, and they basically hold their body with the back legs onto whatever they're holding onto, whether it be a stick or a blade of grass, and then they actually dangle their front legs out in front of them. And if you ever, you can see this in areas where deer ticks are very prevalent. You can see them doing this, which is again pretty scary, but they kind of look like they're doing the wave on the front of a blade of grass where they have their front legs out, and what they're doing is basically setting themselves up to attach and latch onto anything that walks by them. I mentioned that's where that Haller's organ is at, on the front legs. And so they have that out there basically as a heat-seeking, CO2 sensing sensory organ. Not only are they going to be able to feel something go by them, but they're going to be able to say, oh, this smells like a host, there's CO2 coming off of it, and it's warm. Like, they jump off of that stick or grass very quickly, and then they begin their perusing of the animal and eventually biting. Other ticks, unfortunately, to hear, are a little bit more aggressive about how they seek out hosts. They're somewhat actively hunting hosts, or at least they will display a little bit more initiative to get hosts rather than just waiting around on a stick or blade of grass, as successful as that is. Ticks in Lone Star ticks are primarily ticks that are going to be a little more aggressive about finding hosts. And this is utilized in a lot of control strategies as well, which again we'll talk about later. But basically, these are known to crawl several feet, if not several meters, to find a host. So if you were to stand in an area of leaf litter where there are a lot of Lone Star ticks, and you stood there for, let's say, 20, 30 minutes, you would certainly start to see some Lone Star ticks come out of the underbrush and respond to you in the environment exhaling CO2. And the last strategy ticks use to get a blood meal, to find that blood meal, is a little bit more of a passive approach. You can see these ticks on this little mouse here as an example. I mentioned soft ticks earlier in the previous slide. Soft ticks are primarily passive questers, if you will. They typically do not live out in the environment. They're primarily living in nests, burrows, and caves of animals. And so they're really opportunistic and they're waiting for an animal to return to its nest. So that way they can crawl, obviously, across the animal and take a quick blood meal and drop off again. Um, Another thing that I mentioned briefly, but I want to highlight here again, is that soft ticks don't feed for a long period of time. They'll typically only stay attached for maybe a few hours at best, whereas your hard ticks that are going to be doing mainly questing and hunting strategies to find hosts, they're latching on for several days, if not weeks at a time. And so they're just a little bit different from soft ticks. And again, I think that probably becomes natural as to why humans don't really necessarily have a huge chance of interacting with soft ticks. Although, again, there are cases of it happening that are not uncommon at all. Uh, Ticks, hard ticks in particular, and soft ticks as well, have a fairly complex developmental strategy or life history strategy. But again, it does mimic other blood-feeding arthropods and other pestivorous insects in general. The main developmental stages are the egg, the larva, the nymph, and then finally the adult stage. Depending on what type of tick we're talking about and where you're at in the country, is it more cold? Is it more warm? The entire tick life cycle can last as long as 1 year, but it can also be as long as 3 years. So they're pretty hardy, and they have to survive a lot. And again, that makes them just very tough and very hard, for lack of a better term, to control. Um, Importantly, this blood meal ticks take, they're not like mosquitoes where they only have to take a blood meal to, females only have to take a blood meal to produce eggs. Ticks of both sexes require blood meals at each of these different life stages in order to molt into the next stage. So they have to feed quite a bit. And depending on what type of tick and when you're dealing with it specifically, that can have a huge impact on what strategy you might deploy. And that's why I put this CDC generated image of the black-legged or deer tick up here. I think it depicts nicely this slightly longer developmental cycle that a lot of deer ticks have. And what I also wanted to emphasize is that, again, the life stage and what time of year it is can be really important as to when you want to do your treatment. You can see here in the spring, we typically have all three life stages, at least in early spring, of black-legged ticks. And so if you're doing a spray or a granule treatment, it can be really good and very critical to success long-term if you do treatments early in the spring where you can hit all of these life stages. That's not to say that, late summer, early fall, there's actually evidence to suggest similar to things like, similar but different to things like fire ant strategies. A 1-2 punch at different life stages can be useful at knocking down the population. In the fall and even early winter, you can get good control of adults. But that early spring period, for most ticks in general, not just black-legged ticks, is critical to get that population just overall smaller throughout the entire rest of the season. You may have heard this term before, but a lot of ticks are classified based on the number of hosts they have. So we have 1, 2, and 3 host ticks, and nearly any tick will have multiple hosts throughout their life. It's really just determining what kind of host they have. 3 host ticks, for example, will have 3 distinct host types that typically are different sizes. And multi-host ticks are generally the most common, and of those, 3 host ticks are even more common, if not more prevalent, across the entire US. Generally, the preferred host and its size corresponds to the life stage that the tick is in. That's not always true. Ticks are opportunistic. They're going to take blood meals where they can get them. But generally, you'll see larva and nymphal ticks preferring smaller hosts like mice, lizards, and other rodents, while adult ticks will prefer larger hosts like white-tailed deer, dogs, cattle, and unfortunately, humans fall into that larger host category. And again, I think this is really important to understand because with all the diseases that ticks spread, um, they're not they're not hatching with that disease, similar to mosquitoes. Very few of them actually have diseases when they're born out of that egg. They're picking up, as in the case of Lyme disease, for example, they're picking up that bacteria that ultimately causes disease when they feed on a specific host. In the case of Lyme disease, that's the white-footed mice, or mouse rather. That's the main reservoir for that bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi, that again, the nymphal ticks are primarily feeding on. They're picking that bacteria up into their gut, and then later on down the line, when they're larger and they end up biting a human, that's when the bacteria can make its way into the human. They're not these vectors aren't born with a variety of pathogens. They pick them up from their multiple host types that they'll have. And so again, the main ticks that we're concerned about from a pest management perspective, they do have fairly large geographic ranges. These are going to be, again, your black-legged tick, Lone Star tick, American dog tick, and then the uh, brown dog tick. The theme that's repeated across the US as well as locally in Texas is that generally the eastern parts of the state and the country have the highest prevalence of these variety of tick species, with the exception of brown dog tick, which effectively thrives at many climates and states across the entirety of the United States and North America, for that matter. And there's also been a lot of kind of acute incidences that have popped up with brown dog ticks in pretty harsh environments. So they certainly are quite a hardy species, which is probably why they're so widespread. Most, if not all, of those ticks are native to North America or effectively considered native. Um, However, we're not just talking about when we're talking about you know, disease incidents from tick bites as well as nuisance biting from ticks. We're not just talking about um, native ticks. We're also talking about invasive ticks. And just like other groups of insects, there are very recent examples of invasive ticks that have firmly established themselves in North America as recently as 2017, as this tick represents Asian longhorn tick was discovered in 2017 in New Jersey. They likely have the ability to transmit a lot of diseases, but the jury is still out. They're a relatively new invader, and so people are still investigating, thankfully at a good pace, what diseases and what risks these ticks actually pose to humans. One thing that is a little bit more actively being pursued, or was being pursued early in the invasive history, is what potential range this tick may come to inhabit in the U.S. And this is just one example, but there's a really cool piece of work from Rutgers Center for Vector Biology showing that basically the eastern half of the country, most parts of it, and there is a sliver of Texas in there, is certainly going to provide suitable habitat for this tick. And again, because it's again a hardy tick, similar to your dog ticks that we mentioned earlier, we're likely to see this tick spread throughout this entire range. Another kind of interesting or maybe terrifying fact about Asian longhorn ticks that differentiates them from other ticks, and again, I kind of got a little ahead of myself. This will definitely impact their ability to spread very well. Is that female Asian longhorn ticks don't actually have to mate to reproduce to produce offspring. They can produce females can produce offsprings without mating, and that effectively results in clones of these ticks. And so that takes out a huge bottleneck step in their life history and life cycle. They don't have to necessarily mate if they can't find a host. They can just produce offspring. So again, all leading into that concept that these ticks are probably going to spread very well in North America, unfortunately. I mentioned again, just in the interest of time, and again to prevent spreading more confusion than insight. I'm not going to take too deep of a dive into specific ways to do tick identification, but again, I am going to stress that I think it's really important to make yourself more knowledgeable on identification of a lot of pests, not just ticks. So an additional resource that can help you is from obviously a lot of extension agencies. Texas A&M obviously does a great job with their extension service in general, but they have a specific tick app they call that has a lot of resources, not just about identification, but about tick biology, how to remove ticks, how to manage ticks, and how to prevent ticks from biting. The CDC also has a lot of resources about ticks online that can help you identify based on their size, based on their markings, based on where you're at, where you're finding ticks. And so I really encourage everyone to take a look at these resources. And so now we're going to transition into, we've covered some biology, we've covered some scary stats, but again, showing that impact of ticks. We're now going to go into some tried and true methods of tick management, but then also some of the new things that are coming down the pike for tick management depending on species. We've already covered this brief concept here. Again, we've talked about identification and biology. The main three pillars that you're going to be leveraging for doing integrated tick management are going to be utilizing some type of tick trap, depending on, again, what tick you're dealing with and where you're at in the country. But these last two are going to be great resources to provide to your customers and to try to do in any kind of situation where you're dealing with ticks. I talked about this a lot, although I'm not going into it. Maybe it's a cop-out, I don't know, but identification of any pest is always of high importance to any IPM program. And these are images I've used throughout this talk. And again, I've also mentioned these images and what these ticks are a lot. But again, we didn't have a lot of takers on the first question. Any takers on what any of these ticks are? Going from left to right.
You can enter your answer in the chat.
I figured if I tried to make the pause uncomfortably long, maybe we'd get some takers. But I'll go ahead and call this one out. We have the black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis, on the left. We have Amblyomma americanum in the middle with the Lone Star tick, and then we have an American dog tick on the right. But again, check out ID. Why it's important, you have to know what tick you're treating to effectively treat it. But in the case of ticks, I think it's really important, again, when you're talking to your customers, if you know what ticks are there, you can tell them as kind of a self-protection point of view what types of diseases they might be exposed to or should be on the lookout for, and signs and symptoms they should watch out for, again, based on what species of tick is actually there. That, again, leads into another great point that I think we all should be practicing, which is really talk to your customers about what ticks they're dealing with, where they're dealing with them more specifically, and when they're dealing with them. So if you're called out for a tick or tick-related service, always talk to your customers. You'll get things like, I see ticks on my dogs, but only after it hasn't rained for a while. Well, that's because ticks are really sensitive to moisture, and so if it rains, they're gonna be more likely to be out looking for hosts. And so maybe that influences when and where a person wants to take their dogs out for a run. If people are telling you that they've seen ticks in their pants, but only after they've walked through a specific trail in their backyard or in a park nearby, you can say if it's in a park, hey, maybe change that route up or go a different way. If it's in their backyard or someplace that you're actually responsible for treating, obviously that's going to be a place that you want to pay the most attention to and make a very specific application to. So again, just wanted to highlight that it's important to ask your customers where they're dealing with certain problems. I mentioned a lot about traps, and now we're going to finally get into that. I mentioned that black-legged ticks in their larva and nymphal stage are going to heavily rely on small rodents like white-footed mice, their primary host, and also the host they pick up, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. And so several groups have developed a variety of strategies for dealing with that specific life stage and that host in particular. And what that has yielded is what's called a tick tube. This one in particular is made by Thermacell, but effectively it's a small tube that is placed in the environment, again, when you're dealing with deer ticks, specifically in the Northeast. So again, maybe not super relevant here, but I think generally, depending on where you're at, this could be useful for deer ticks, which are in Texas. You put these tubes near habitat where you think white-footed mice are, and the idea is that they pick up this cotton inside the tube to build their nest. The nest is treated with permethrin. I'm sorry, the cotton is treated with permethrin, and so when the mice bring that back to their nest and start spending time in that nest, raising their young in that nest, they're actually going to be treating themselves with permethrin and thus reducing the number of ticks that are on them, if not killing them. The similar but somewhat different tick box that's been developed that does a similar type of mode of action in terms of it treats mice that visit this station with fipronil. Obviously, we know it's a great active ingredient, kills ticks very effectively. This is effectively a bait station for rodents that lures them in and then treats them. They have to go across a certain location that has a wick that treats them with that fipronil product. It has still kind of evolving through various state registration agencies. It's not labeled for use in Texas, and really not other states outside of the Northeast or any other locations where Lyme disease rates are not super high. The bait, as it does, gets people very concerned and maybe rightfully so. And so again, just another plug to say, check your labels and your laws when you're looking at some of these new strategies. But then lastly, when we're talking about Lone Star ticks, again, ticks that are going to be out hunting and responding to CO2 more prevalently, there's a couple new tick traps on the market that utilize either CO2 or dry ice that effectively lure ticks to a certain location and then capture them with a sticky card. These are great because not only do they kill ticks that are getting stuck to the sticky card, but they're great for identification purposes and monitoring purposes because the ticks stay stuck to the card, and you can go back and see how many there were at different times of the year, when were they, and so you can get some additional information about the ticks in an area. This is kind of just for general knowledge. I don't think anyone here is going to be doing tick drags. I've done a few of these myself, and you end up covered in ticks generally, so not something I'd recommend. But this is dragging for ticks is one of the #1 strategies that researchers and specific vector control agencies use to monitor ticks and tick populations in certain areas. As the name suggests, you effectively attach a fairly heavy piece of cloth, burlap works all right, to a dowel rod, and make yourself a drag effectively on that dowel. And you typically do this in some kind of organized fashion in a grid or other predetermined sampling method to survey an area of tick habitat, which is typically really nice, long, overgrown grass or fields like you see here, and you're effectively dragging that through that area to pick up ticks that latch onto that cloth. Again, don't expect people to be doing this, but I just wanted to let you know that this kind of mimics that last tick trap that we saw that gives you some additional information about the tick species there that can inform, your knowledge of when you're treating and what you're treating. And So where are ticks at in a specific habitat? When you go out to do a treatment, where are areas that you should specifically be targeting? This might be one of the most important slides that I talk about today, I think. Um, the age-old question of why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Um, why do ticks inhabit the areas they do? Because that's where their hosts are primarily at, and that's where they're going to get blood. That's where they're going to get a meal. So in any type of property that you're likely to find a high density of ticks, there's probably suitable habitat for them from a survival perspective. High humidity is super, super important for ticks. And so you can imagine places like leaf litter and places that have just a lot of vegetation coverage are going to have less sunlight, and therefore you're just going to have higher moisture in general. The three main areas you want to look for are, as I mentioned, forest and dense tree lines that provide shade, tall grasses that go over edges of managed grass are huge areas to monitor, and then any area there's an accumulation of leaf litter. That's a huge developmental area for a lot of juvenile ticks. Um, Piles of decomposing leaves that we all have in our various locations and properties are great spots to focus treatment on. And then another area that is, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, is any location that has an edge. So where you have a transitional zone where a lawn or managed space meets an unmanaged space that provides shade, or let alone has other geographic features that might provide a lot of coverage or protection for ticks. Where you have wood piles, where you have stone walls, where you have things that separate these transitional edges, those are good areas to, again, really focus on when you're doing treatments. Habitat modification is like for other pests. I'm thinking of like filth flies and controlling the site as best as you can really do a lot to control an individual specific property. Keeping your grass cut short is great. Again, pruning branches, making sure adequate sunlight's getting to parts of a yard or parts of a property, not from an aesthetic perspective, but again, just to control sunlight and to control that moisture that's sticking around for long periods of time. Excuse me. There's some evidence to suggest that constructing these transitional zone xeriscapes, typically with some type of well-drained material. In this picture here, you can see there's some kind of gravel in here, separating this wooded area from a managed area. And effectively, this just gives you a barrier of very low moisture, very unsuitable habitat for ticks that, in theory, is going to limit some type of spread, if there is any, of ticks from the unmanaged environment into the managed environment. And another great strategy similar to that is to just control the number of mammals that are going through your individual property that you can tell to your customers. Obviously, I don't know, I like to see the flora and fauna that are around, but again, that does come with some risks, especially if you're in a tick prevalent area, because once those ticks feed on those mammal hosts, they're going to drop off. And if that's in an area in your or a customer's yard that's conducive to them sticking around and waiting for another host, they're probably going to do that once they drop off. And so we talked about where ticks are in a landscape, how to manage them, and now I want to talk a little bit about how to specifically apply some of these insecticides. We're talking about applying pesticides effectively 3 feet and down, so about waist height and down. We are not talking about foliar applications. We're not talking about, generally ticks are not going to be in a really nice managed yard. You're just not going to find them hanging out in that area. And so it doesn't make sense at all to treat an entire yard in the yard sense necessarily when you're talking about controlling ticks. We're talking about targeted sprays, typically at high pressure, that again are generally from the waist down, angling at a downward direction like that. Typically, these are liquid residual sprays with AIs such as bifenthrin, permethrin, deltamethrin, and there are some also pretty effective essential oil blends that are very similar to products that you would use for mosquito control. I'm thinking of things like Ecovia. On the synthetic side, I'm thinking of things like DeltaGuard, Bifen, Talstar. Um, the main idea, again, is to apply to leaf litter, non-woody vegetation below the waist, and then again, focusing on that perimeter treatment at the yard to forest or unmanaged area interface. Granules can be really effective, again, because they're going to go into the soil, into the leaf litter, and they're going to give you a little bit longer residual control as they disintegrate. AIs are very similar between the liquid residual sprays we talked about above. And again, you're really going to apply them to pretty much the same areas, but obviously it's going to be on the ground. And again, focusing on leaf litter because again, those are going to penetrate that a little bit better, especially as they get wet. And then the yard to unmanaged area interface. And then these area specific harborage sites that I mentioned in the previous slide or previous 2 slides ago, wood piles, stone fence lines, any place that looks like it's harboring a lot of moisture is a good place to focus on. And so these treatment strategies are generally pretty similar for a lot of ticks, and it is, I'm happy, I think we all are, that it's generalized like that. There's one tick in particular that we talked about earlier when we talked about range distribution, the brown dog tick. It unfortunately, as the name suggests, preferred host is dogs. You'll find a lot of these on your animals wherever you're at in the country, and they unfortunately get brought inside a lot. And because of that, they've at least somewhat adapted to survival in the indoor environment. And we know that unfortunately, if there's suitable conditions, they can find cracks and crevices, thinking like a bed bug here, they can complete their entire life cycle successfully indoors. And so this is not uncommon to run into. Several people on the call may have dealt with this before. Here, your strategy is going to change a little bit. Obviously, you're not treating in the outdoor environment. You're really going to be looking for liquid residuals, crack and crevice treatments with those, as well as with dusts, things that can really penetrate into areas that are discrete that these ticks are going to be utilizing if they're in the indoor environment. And just like bed bugs and a lot of other pests, sanitation is going to be a huge strategy for resolving issues in an indoor environment with brown dog ticks. So either washing the pet bedding, completely getting rid of it, and then vacuuming is going to be a great strategy to complement any kind of insecticidal treatment that is being applied. And so that's the gist on treatment, and that kind of brings us close to the end of the talk. But again, I do have some additional information about ticks that I wanted to share with you that I think is relevant. The first isn't necessarily super exciting, but is very important. This is, again, like other pests, but maybe more specific to public health pests. We want to make sure that we have the correct licensure to do treatments for ticks. Generally, in Texas, commercial applicators that have the standard structural pest control license are good to go to provide treatments for ticks in the landscape, and as well as obviously in the home. However, a call out here is that if the tick treatment is bundled with any other treatment that's aimed at the broader flora itself, then the applicator must also have a lawn and ornamental certificate associated with their structural pest control license. Generally, I don't think that's going to be the case too often, but again, it depends on the structure of how those things are being sold. Additionally, and importantly, if the treatment is to be performed for any agency that's funded by a city, a county, or other government municipality to protect specifically public health on public lands, applicators must also possess the Texas Department of Ag Category 12 license for public health pest control. That's just in Texas. There's quite a bit of variation among the states as to the laws that govern pesticide licensing for public health pests like ticks and ticks in general. Some have specific mosquito and vector control licenses. Obviously, that also impact the types of products you can use. I'm thinking of the Northeast here in particular. And so, just like always, make sure to read your label and obviously read your regulations regarding your licensure and make sure that you're doing everything by the book. Lastly, I want to cover something that has a lot of, I wouldn't say contention around it, but I think a lot of people have their own ideas about how to do this, and a lot of them are good and probably fine, but I just wanted to present you with ways to remove ticks from yourselves and pets. And this is, again, coming straight from the CDC, and I think it is a pretty effective way to do tick removal. And unfortunately, I can say that I've removed or had removed by someone else a lot of ticks from myself, and this works great. The main idea is that when you find an embedded tick, you want to grab that tick to remove it as close to the head as possible. And so that can be with your fingernails, depending on if you have, I don't have super great fingernails necessarily for doing this, but a lot of people do. You can get them close to the skin as possible, get on the head and pull them out straight back with steady pressure. What I like to do is get a pair of tweezers or other forceps and mimic fingernails effectively, but again, grab that head and effectively pull straight back on the tick to remove it. Once you remove the tick, and again, it will generally stretch the skin. That's what you're looking for. So don't be afraid if it does pull back a little bit, and it probably will hurt to some degree. But when you're done with that, you do want to sanitize that area. So washing it with warm soapy water is fine. You can do some alcohol if that makes you feel better with the pathogens that ticks might spread. That's always a good idea. But make sure you clean it, that tick bite area. And the last thing is to make sure when you're doing the removal is to not squeeze the body of the tick. We talked about this again. The ticks are going to be harboring the nasty bacteria or other life in their gut that spreads disease, and that's going to be transmitted to you or any other animal they bite over time. Not going to happen right away. They forage for a long period of time. They blood feed for a long period of time. And so if you squeeze the butt of that tick, you're going to effectively cause the tick to regurgitate somewhat quickly all of their gut contents into your skin, and thus expose you pretty quickly to whatever nastiness the tick might have in its gut. And the last thing I wanted to say about grabbing ticks as well, the reason you want to grab from the head and pull straight back as well is to prevent the tick from breaking apart. It's not the end of the world if there's some tick body part left in you. It's probably going to be the head or the capitulum, but it just feels better, and it is the preferred method if you can get the entire tick body out. That's going to come from not twisting and yanking on it, but it's going to come from a direct, steady pressure backwards from the tick bite. And so with that, we reached the end of the slides, but again, I'd like to thank everyone for having me and letting me talk about these crazy creatures, but would now like to open the floor to any questions as well.
Josiah, super interesting. Thank you again. We do have actually a really interesting question from an anonymous source. If a customer has a pet that she thinks got ticks from a walk, should we treat her backyard?
That's a really good question. There is some evidence to suggest, or there are some stats to suggest, where ticks are most prevalently coming from in the environment. Are people picking them up in their backyard? Are they generally getting them from the environment? I think the consensus is, I'd have to double check this, but my gut is telling me that the consensus is we probably pick up a lot of these ticks in the course of our daily activities, going for walks, walking our dogs, doing general recreation things. It's summertime right now. People are outside a lot. So I think it really depends on the conditions of the backyard environment. Do they have a great transition zone of wooded to non-managed or to managed landscaping? Do they have a wood pile or two, or stone walls that are separating the property boundaries? Because the idea might be that those ticks are going to feed on the pet and then maybe drop off in the backyard as the dog is outside later on. and maybe hang around for a while and reproduce potentially depending on what stage they're in. So, excuse me, that's definitely it's a great question. Thank you for asking that, whoever did. But I think again, the answer is it's not straightforward. I think it depends on the conditions and it depends on maybe what tick it is. But you really have to think about all of those factors before you say, oh, you definitely got to treat your backyard for ticks. Like that's tough to say. I know there is some literature on this, and I believe the consensus there is that we probably are picking up a lot of these tick bites when we're doing things in our environment. But again, that's not to say that we don't have risk in our backyards, because I believe in one paper or two that I'm thinking of, they do mention that we're not talking about zero risk in our backyard. We're talking maybe like a 60-40 split or 70-30 or something. It's not 95.5% chance of encounter here, but not here. So I hope that helps, but
Exactly.
maybe not the
Well, thank you,
deepest.
Paige. That was a great question. So I know we don't have much time left, Josiah, but I really want our audience to hear your answer to this question. So the tick bite that is causing the allergen to red meat or other mammalian meat, I'd like you to jump through that just really quick so everybody can hear that. It's super, super interesting and terrifying for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. Me as well. Alpha gal, what alpha gal stands for is alpha galactose, and so the disease is basically an allergy to alpha galactose, which is basically just a sugar molecule. And how people become allergic to it, because it's in a lot of different, if not all, mammalian meat. It's not in human meat, thankfully, or human flesh rather. Excuse me, but it is prevalent in a lot of animals. And so, how people become allergic to it acutely after a tick bite is Lone Star ticks are the vector for alpha gal. We talked about them a lot today. They are going to pick that molecule up in high quantities as they're feeding through a variety of different hosts, because again, they're feeding on mammals to get their blood. When they make a bite, your body is reacting via a fairly generalized immune response to that bite and a lot of other things that the tick is putting into your body besides pathogens. There's anticoagulants, there's a local anesthetic so you don't detect the bite itself. And what's also coming into your body when you have a Lone Star tick bite in large quantities, is alpha galactose, which the tick has picked up. And so your body is reacting to all these things at one time. And so your immune system kind of gets tricked and starts to also sequester an immune response to that alpha galactose molecule that's after that tick bite. And so unfortunately, your immune system gets trained on that alpha gal. And so you have that happen, and then the next time you eat meat, the next time you smell meat or touch meat, a lot of people have different symptoms that are pretty hard to nail down. That's why your body has just built up an immune response associated with the tick bite that comes with a side consequence of also an allergy to alpha galactose. And it's a pretty fascinating story. But again, as with immune responses in general, the symptoms are difficult, and unfortunately, the disease that results in it is kind of a side effect of something else, which is that tick bite and a lot of other nasty stuff coming through. But really interesting, I think.
Yep, very interesting and terrifying. That's right up there with any other fear that I could possibly have, including heights. So, I don't see any other questions popping up, Josiah. Man, I really appreciate you jumping in for us repeatedly. You've been a great resource for us, and just really appreciate your dedication to the TPCA and the industry in general.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.